So do you want a break in between this one
Recess, yep.
and
So
or
we'll
recess? Yeah,
recess,
yeah.
yes.
Because you need to set it up and all that, right?
Yep, just
Okay.
because we're moving to the next room and it's gonna be a close.
Okay. Good evening. The time is now 6 o'clock. The Wayzata Public Schools Board of Education special regular meeting for Monday, September 23rd, 2024 will please come to order. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Valentina Ayers,
Here.
Dan Ginestra,
Here.
Sarah Johansson,
Here.
Paris Bende,
Here.
Sheila Pryor, here, Heidi Cater,
Here.
Milan Sahoni.
Present. We have a quorum. There is no consent agenda for this meeting. The next item on our agenda is the approval of the agenda. The only item today is approval of the preliminary 2024 payable 2025 levy limitation and certification. Is there a recommended action is to approve the agenda? Is there a motion?
Do we need to add the closed meeting to that? It's part of the-
That's a separate meeting, so we have to call it separately. Is that?
She said it's not.
It's an agenda item for this meeting, and then you go into closed session as a part of this meeting. Is that correct, Amy? Okay, thank you.
All right, so then there are two items on the agenda. This is the one I just mentioned, and then there is also a closed meeting followed by this meeting where we will have the annual superintendent evaluation. The recommended action is to approve the agenda.
So moved?
Second. Moved and seconded. Will the clerk please take a roll call vote?
Sarah Johansson,
Yes.
Paris Bende,
Yes.
Sheila Pryor, yes, Heidi Cater,
Yes?
Valentina Ayers,
Yes.
Dan Ginestra,
Yes.
Milan Sahoni.
Yes, we have an agenda. Thank you. Okay, there is a request for approval of the preliminary 2024 payable 2025 levy limitation and certification, which will be brought to us by the Executive Director of Finance and Operations, Scott Lesage. Scott.
Perfect. Thank you, Board Chair Sahoni, board members, and Superintendent Anderson. So I was hoping my crowd was going to stick around tonight, but it looks in normal fashion, especially for the levy, and I don't blame people. So it seems like we just went over this levy stuff. The years seem to go quick. It's kind of crazy that we're in another levy cycle. And as you can imagine, it's a busy time of year for us. This is arguably probably the busiest time of year with levy preparation, the audit, the school year kicking off, and us starting to watch to see if our projections are good. So busy time of year. Over the last month and a half, our team's been working with MDE and the state to enter the necessary information in the levy information system for the components and parts that we control. And then we've also been reviewing the levy limitation and certification report. So for those of you that don't know, it's an interesting read. The Department of Ed puts it together for us. It's a 39-page document. Full of numbers, formulas, and a lot of things referencing back to other pages, and the numbers aren't necessarily in order either. So it's a complex document. I always tell the joke that when I started in schools, my first day at Redwood Area Schools, my predecessor was really busy with the audit, and he handed me the levy limitation certification report and said, hey, look it over and then let me know what you think. And afterwards, once we got to know each other, I said, John, why did he do that? And he said, I knew what I was doing. So, but it was my introduction to that. So you all received in the board packet an in-depth description of this preliminary levy. And we tried to include and explain the levy process with additional graphs and detailed breakdowns. So hopefully that was super helpful and gave the board and the public a lot of background and detailed information. So I probably won't go into the depths of that today, but you have that information as well, and we'll touch on that. So before we go into the next slide, I also wanted to thank Jen Welk and David Draskovich. Jen is still here, and David Draskovich has had a busy couple of weeks with audit prep, and our auditors are on site this week and next week. So he has the night off, and Jen, I'm sorry this took so long. So But they've been instrumental. It's that team concept that we do in finance and operations. You've got Jen, who has a huge background in special fundings and our enrollment, which is a huge part of this. And then you've got David Draskovich involved as the director of finance with the budgeting component, because this is a huge portion of our budget as well. So I just wanted to thank them. All right. Can I control it too, Amy? Okay. Yes, I can. Okay, perfect. All right, so the presentation of the preliminary levy is really the initial or prelim part of a two-part process. This part is done now, with the final part being done at our December board meeting. And that will be at our regular board meeting in December. The reason for this part is we have to have this certified to the state of Minnesota by September 30th, hence the meeting today. December will be when we'll come to the board and ask them to certify the actual amounts, not to the maximum. This is the reason for that is this is kind of the in-between stage. So I think statutorily MDE has to have us the first readout of the levy limitation report, I think by September 6th, depending on when the weekend falls. I think it was September 8th this year. And then there's several runs of this document. I think we're getting a run every 2 or 3 days. And so it's updating, and that's where our team reviews this document pretty thoroughly. And then we pick a date where we put this presentation together for you, knowing that some things could change as the state and MDE make adjustments to the levy report. So as I mentioned, it must be certified by the Board of Education by September 30th. We would recommend the district certify the prelim tax levy at this special meeting to the maximum. So let me see, anything else summarizing? So we'll kind of go into a few of the other slides. As I mentioned, MDE calculates the levy. The levy limitations and certifications report is a 39 long page document. And so, as I mentioned, this is still being updated, and it's for property taxes collected in 2025. So you always hear our finance team talk about that we live in 3 different fiscal years. This is like the prime time of that. So right now we have auditors on site that are auditing last fiscal year. So David, his team, Jen Welk behind me here, they're still working in last year's and in the current year. And then with the levy here, these are for payable 2025, which is for next year's budget, which you'll see come to the board in June of this 2025. So as you can see, there's lots of moving parts, and we live in a lot of different years. So what are the causes? What causes increases and decreases in the levies? State law, so legislative action can impact all of these pretty tremendously. Just like with our state aid and our regular budget, pupil units and the number of students we have are a huge component of the levy. The population for the district can also have a big impact. But as you know, with our student population, we've experienced some changes over the year, especially due to the pandemic. But now we're seeing a pretty big bounce back, as we've talked about. The market value or tax capacity, which is our tax base, this also impacts the levies pretty tremendously as the district grows. We'll see more about that coming up. We're in a situation where we've seen that market value and tax capacity increase pretty substantially over the years, and that has a direct impact on our levy as well that we'll get into. And finally, some of our levies are tied directly to expenditures. A notable example would be in our community ed child care program for children with special needs. That's based on expenditures. So essentially, legislative action combined with revenue formulas, student enrollment growth, and fluctuations in individual taxpayers' market value adds complexity to the school district's local property tax revenue. I just included this slide. This is we received this slide from our partners at Ehlers, who help us with a lot of this area. But this just provides the reader and the board more information on RMV and NTC. Just because we talk about those acronyms all the time, just gives you a background on the definition of each of those. I won't go in too much into these, but you'll notice from the RMV that it closely aligns with assessed market value of the types of properties that pay towards referendum market value levies and represents the market value of those properties. The net tax capacity is calculated by taking the taxable market value of the property times its property classification rate. You've probably heard in prior presentations, the classification rates, those are determined by the legislature. All right, so now we'll get into a little bit of the slides here. This one basically just shows the proposed 2025 payable versus the final payable 2024. As you can see, we only get tax levy dollars for our general fund, which is Fund 1, which is our bigger one that we come to the board with continuously, Fund 4, which is community service, and our debt service fund. Those are the three areas included on here, so you can see what they're proposed for 2025 in comparison to the prior year. The general fund is expected to be around 75 million based on these prelim numbers, which is about 3.93% increase. This is right in line with last year, which was at 3.84. Community education is up $95,000 and is expected to be about 2.1 million at about 4.7%. And then debt service is what we use to pay our principal and interest on our debt payments is expected to be around 18.7, and that's up slightly 5.5%. The most important thing to pay attention to is the overall total change, as that's what impacts the taxpayers and the revenue that the district will receive. So we always just like to point to that bottom right number, which is 4.2%. This is slightly down from 4.9% last year. And just kind of a little bit of information, over the last 7 years, the district has averaged an annual levy increase of 4.36%, while during that same time period, we saw the NTC increase by 8.49%. So I know this and all can be a little bit confusing, and I'll dig into it a little bit before, but because our next net tax capacity is increasing, even when we're seeing increases, what we've been averaging in that 4.36% or 4.26% that we're showing today, the impact to the taxpayers is actually less than the percent that we're showing up there, just because our tax base is growing so much. All right, as mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we included a detailed analysis of the general fund in the board packet, but here's a description. In this description, these are consolidated, so I'll hit on kind of each of those numbers and go through each of those four categories just to give you kind of a better understanding. So overall, the general fund levy increased by 3.93% or 2.8 million. The RMV voter approved levies, and that's the top line there. We are expecting that to be around 32 million. And you'll see a slight negative number in there and then a negative change of 1.99%. These are voter approved levies. So it would be like our operating referenda. This went down slightly this year. If you recall, this one increased by roughly 6.5 million last year, but this year we're projecting that it's going to go down by about 660,000. Not diving too deep into the details, but kind of the backdrop on this is that our enrollment increased for these projections just under 1%. And then our increase in the operating referendum allowance of 2.288%, which increased the per pupil amount from $21.63 to $22.25. So that increased our revenue by roughly 1.2 million. But on the same token, with adjustments from prior years, with our enrollment projections like post-pandemic, during the pandemic, we have roughly a change of 1.8 million. So when you combine the two with the math, that's where we get the negative 660. Enrollment continues to be up post-pandemic. The district increased those projections as part of the payable 2024 levy, which was reflected in that larger than typical adjustment that we had last year. That's something our team went in and adjusted last year. Obviously, when you're putting these in, you're putting them in for several years out. When the pandemic happened, no one could have predicted that, and then that had huge impacts on our levies, which you'll even see in our financial statement that was finished last year, not the current one, that we also had to set aside money for these levy adjustments coming through, just because As you recall, if the district would have stayed on the trajectory with the student population, it would have been significantly higher right now, which then, due to those adjustments, we would have collected dollars that we necessarily weren't supposed to have. So that's where they take these back, and that's where we see these adjustments. RMV, I won't point out too much on this one, but this is where the LOR sits. So LOR is just local optional revenue. And this came about in 2013 when the legislature allowed school boards to pass a $300 operating referendum. And then in 2014, they followed it up with adding an additional $424. The primary purpose of this was kind of to pull money out of operating referendums that districts had and give the board authority to use that in case something failed, so that it would kind of protect districts. For us, there's really not an impact. It's pulled out of our operating referendum, but net, it's the same. So it doesn't really impact us, but just giving you a little history on that. The NTC voter approved, this is where our capital projects levy lives. So you can see here, that's where that's housed, and our tech levy, that's indexed directly to the NTC. And so I think when we look back last year, we approved one of the tech levies, one of our 2 tech levies. And so those tech levies account for just under 5% total overall to the net tax capacity. So like I talked about, our net tax capacity was increasing. Well, as that increases, that percentage is multiplied by that, which then increases our tech levy or our capital projects levy. All right, and then NTC other, that bottom one, majority of this is our LTFM, and it's valued also against the NTC. This is one area that our team has come to the board several times. This is where LTFM can live, and we've seen pretty wild swings in this. So we're trying to stabilize this. Last year we had a huge adjustment. We're expecting some adjustment next year, and then we're hoping to level out. Obviously, that was not our intention. That was another impact of the pandemic where we had wild swings and adjustments. I think when Wold was here, or KA, they talked about, John Deutsch mentioned that if we truly wanted to keep up with all the projects with LTFM for all the districts around, we would really be spending closer to $21 million a year, but that just has not been feasible. So with John's new person in place, we're excited. He's kind of getting ahead of it this year. And with our planning, and we're hoping we can get caught up on those projects, and then hopefully we don't have the supply chain issues we did, and we're also starting to see price kind of normalize. I'm scared to say that, but so we're looking to that. The only other notable change in the NTC other is a prior period adjustment. This is something that we knew about last year. It was in the tune of $1.5 million. We did not take the adjustment last year. It was an error on MDE's side, and we took it in the current year, so it was a positive adjustment back for the district, and that was related to our lease levy dollars. So we took that in the current year. So like I mentioned, there can be ebbs and flows between each of these areas, and it gets complicated and confusing, but the big thing to pay attention is the bottom line for the general fund, and that's where you'll see there on the bottom. We're proposing roughly $75.4 million, an increase of roughly 2.8, and that comes out to 3.9%. And that is very close with last year's, like I mentioned, at 3.84, and that increase last year at this time was projected to be 2.6 million. Community service, that's the next one we have up here. You'll see not a ton of change. This is our smallest levy area at 2.1 million, but these dollars are very crucial for the community education team and department. As you recall from budget presentations, community ed is primarily driven by being fee-based, and so these dollars are absolutely critical to the support of that program. The largest component of the community service levy is the school age care, and this is estimated to be at $985,000, slightly up from last year. Otherwise, relatively stable figures for this area. And then you just have your normal adjustments that we had on there that flow through from year to year. Some of these, as you see, the basic levy and early childhood levy are based on district population, and they're based on district census. So as we also see our population grow, that increases some of those dollars. But these are primarily used for like our youth services, after school enrichment, home visiting, adults with disabilities, early childhood education, and its staff and gets support these students with special needs supplies and training. So on this one, you can see, like I mentioned, we're looking at 2.1 million, so an increase of just 95,000, and that's roughly 4.7%. All right, next we'll look at debt service. Like the general fund, there's several different categories, but the main thing to look at is the overall percentage on the bottom right. There's a lot of ebbs and flows in here, but some of the main things I'll point out is we're required to collect 105% for our principal interest payments to make sure that the payments are made. We have a very high percentage paying district, so you'll see the item right below that is a debt excess. Inside of that debt excess is when the state kind of pulls back from collecting that 105% year over year. You start to build that up, and they basically adjust and take some of those dollars back, as we would expect them to do, which is the right thing. When you look at, we also have alt facility bonds in there. Those are prior to when we had the authority we do for LTFM. We had some bond issues in there. And then the debt excess with that is related to those alt facility bonds, and then the abatements and prior year adjustments. Those are just normal ebbs and flows from prior year adjustments. Just kind of on a side note, I think we're roughly sitting, they're finalizing that with the audit right now, but we're roughly sitting with about 245 million in bonded debt. And then if you add the COPs, that's roughly around 252 million. So these dollars that we raise for the levy go to make those principal and interest payments. As you can see here, it's a slight increase of 984,000, which is 5.5%. This slide, I know this slide is hard to see. I didn't know how to make it any bigger. Hopefully on your screens you're able to see it, but I know Dee Dee and probably Jim had these in her packet the year before. This is another document that we rely on our consultants, Ehlers, to help us with. They do a really nice job of putting this together. But this kind of gets back to what we talked about, where we're seeing our referendum market value, our net tax capacity, they're increasing pretty substantially. And so what this does, it models basically, it looks at residential homestead, commercial industrial, and apartments. Last year they had them broken out, but they put it all on one for us this year. So essentially, to make it apples to apples and show the impact to the taxpayers, obviously values change. And like we said, our referendum market value goes up, net tax capacity goes up. So people's valuations of their homes are also going up. But for this practice, it's showing apples to apples. So it's like if you take last year and that house was $200,000 last year, and let's say it didn't increase in valuation at all, that would be the impact to the taxpayer on that. So as you can see, basically, if you look over on the right, there's one negative on top. There's some slight impacts in this, but it's roughly around that 2.3% at the max for residential and homestead. And again, that's apples to apples to last year, but it doesn't account for the increased valuation with it. The same with commercial and industrial and then apartments. And that's where I was getting at earlier, that we're going up 4.26%, but because those RMV and our NTC are increasing at such a rapid rate because we're expanding our tax base, they're not hit with that percent that we're talking about. All right. And I added this slide kind of last minute today. This is another one. I had to pull myself back, and Dana and Stacy aren't here, so they can't be like, hurry up. I'm kidding, they don't do that. But I like seeing some of this data too, because this kind of shows you the breakdown of where our dollars come in. So this shows 46% of our total levy is based on the referendum market value. So that's the huge one at the 20 billion. And then the other 54% is the net tax capacity. And just a reminder, the RMV, something inside of that would be our referendums, the LOR that I talked about earlier, and then the next net tax capacity includes our capital projects levy and the LTFM component. All right, I think this is one of our final slides. So the next step is we're asking the board to approve the preliminary levy to the maximum, as the board's done in the past, as I think most districts do, just because of, like I mentioned, we're still kind of in that in-between time. So we're asking the board not to approve a certain amount that you've seen or a percentage tonight. That will come in December when we get those amounts, but levying to the maximum doesn't mean we can just levy whatever we want. It's within the parameters with what the state legislature MDs set. It just gives us the flexibility that if there's error recognized or something to be added or removed at a later time, it would give the district and the board that flexibility for the December meeting. So then after that, as I mentioned, we'll have a truth and taxation meeting at our December regular board meeting on December 9th. And that's where the public will be able to come and make comment and be asked questions about the levy process. At that point is where we'll be asking the board to certify the final numbers for the levy. All right. So this final slide is just a summary again of the overall total and percentage. We would be recommending that the board approve this to the maximum. Same thing that you saw, it's just kind of a final summary showing that 4.26% compared to last year's 4.9%. And so I think without, is that my last one? Yes, it is. So this is the conclusion of the presentation. So I would now just turn it back to the board and recommend the board to approve the preliminary levy to the maximum.
Thank you, Scott. The recommended action is to approve the preliminary 2024 payable 2025 levy limitation and certification at the maximum amount allowed by the state. Is there a motion?
I so move. Second?
Thank you. Any discussion?
I have one question.
Yeah.
On that last slide, so last year it was 4.9.
Yes.
Let's assume this year it stays 4.3, so 0.6 reduction.
Yep.
What does that translate to? Meaning, is it the expenses are going down, we don't need that revenue, or is it being compensated by the state reimbursement? How do we read that 6% or 0.6% reduction?
That's a great question. It's a super complex one because there's so many moving parts in the background. It can be anywhere from, like I talked about, that we have our capital projects levy tied to our NTC. It can be changes in valuation to the NTC, to the RMV. We had population or student population adjustments from prior years, so you get a lot of adjustments. We also saw some leveling because last year, if you recall, we went out and issued the 2023A bond, which then increased the debt service. So that was substantially more last year. And we also saw a big adjustment with that student population in the general fund. So I don't know that I'm necessarily answering your question, but there's a lot of components in the background. I wouldn't say that expenditures are going down because they absolutely are not. As we're a growing organization, student populations continuing to rise, but it's just a makeup of all those adjustments, changes, and then some of those components they could shift a little bit from state-based versus levy-based.
Okay. So from the community or from resident standpoint, is that a good thing, bad thing, neutral thing? So for instance, if we look at the residential tax rate increase,
Yep.
yes, there is increase in tax, but when you look at the levy, it's, let's say, 0.6% less.
Yep.
So how would, community, how would they read it? Like, how should they read it?
Yeah.
Just because their, tax is going up, but then the actual need in our budget is going down, right? So how do we comment on that?
I think it could be looked at as a positive for both the district and the community. And what I mean by that is because our net tax capacity and our referendum market valuation has increased so substantially, the tax levy portion for the district, the school district part of their property tax statement, is being spread farther to more people so that it's less of an impact on an individual. Obviously, we recognize that valuations of individual homes are also increasing, and that would be pretty impossible to calculate one by one, but that's what the county does. But essentially, long story short, I think it's a positive and a win-win for both the district and the community because we are seeing that increase in valuation.
Okay. And then within each of those funds, those 4 different line items, right? And you talked about NTC, others, for example, that's, the LTFM, right? Or debt services. So again, do we have the same restriction that within each of those categories, you can apply that revenue only to certain aspects of expenditure, or can you move across those categories in general fund or community aid, or you have to stay within those subcategories?
They would have to stay within those funds, absolutely, especially with that community ed and the general fund. And then to add more complexity to it, just like with our normal general fund budget that we present, some of those dollars that are levied have to be for specific purposes, like our LTFM, our PAYGO, our achievement and integration, several other funding streams are tied exactly to the uses of these dollars that are generated.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Scott, I have one question. You did not have a slide in there, which I had seen earlier in your deck of slides when that was emailed to the board, and it was probably also available on the board book. It's the graph of the ADM, average daily membership, versus levies. It's one of those
Oh, yeah.
column charts. So it's
Yep.
simple question, because I don't understand that. What is the significance? Because you started with, if you're looking from left to right, you started with ADM up here, went dipped down. I think that was during COVID probably, and then it went up, and the levies have all gone up. So what is the significance of that gap between the ADM and the highest levy in each year?
That's a great question. I apologize I didn't have that in. I know that's in the other document that is in the board packet, available for the board and the public. But that's a great question. Something I looked at myself, because you would assume that obviously that the pupil unit is a driver of those revenues. Well, as you recall, that dip happened during the pandemic, and I alluded to in the presentation that we went in and adjusted those figures. So you would just see a lower increase in the prior years, and that's where we were getting all these huge swings and adjustments that you saw in the levy, and why we had to hold out some of the dollars even in our audit last year. So it basically, because we're projecting out like a year to ahead, you're going to have that, and so then it catches up later on.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions? If not, okay. Again, the recommended action is to. Oh, sorry.
I was not quick enough.
Your hand up, I can
Sorry.
Thank you.
Question I have about, you mentioned about that taxpayers will see increase in the value of the houses, but I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think that it is also, you see, because of obviously how much we experience, I'm forgetting the word all of a sudden, of inflation, and obviously we lived through that. I mean, from my student years, inflation, it means you cannot, maybe you have bigger numbers, but what you can buy with it is completely, what you can buy with it is becoming, it's diminishing. So do you mean when taxpayers will see increase in the value of the houses, and how they will see the increase if we know that the inflation is quite high?
Thank you for the question. I think they're kind of two different things. The district side of this, like all of that, like I mentioned, is set by state law, and then the assessments would be done by the county. So the district would be separate from that. We wouldn't have anything to do with the valuations of homes. As for the inflationary aspect, that also wouldn't be anything that would be controlled by the district. That would just be the state of the economy that we're living in, that we wouldn't necessarily have any control over. I think what I was showing is just basically looking at the same house, if it was valued at the same price as last year, and again, we don't have control over how those valuations are, that would be more of the county. We're just talking about the school district's portion of that levy and what that would do to that individual homeowner at that price point. So does that make sense? They're kind of, I think I understand your question. I think they're two very different things. Does that make sense? Or because we wouldn't be able to control inflation, and the district doesn't determine the house valuation.
Yeah, that part I understand, but at the same time, I am talking from taxpayer point of view. When you mentioned that the value increased, the value of house,
Yep.
Of what, the value of what in that case then? You mentioned about there is going to be an increase, which taxpayers will see as a positive side. positive side of that value of a house is, going to be higher?
What I was alluding to is the fact that because the referendum market value is increasing and the net tax capacity is increasing, what can be new developments, it can be higher valuations of current existing homes and businesses. What I mean is that's growing. So the dollars that we're asking for, the school district's portion, are spread amongst those. So if the reverse was true, if the district was contracting and we were losing businesses and houses were coming offline and we weren't expanding, that pressure would go more to those individuals,
Okay.
if that makes sense.
Yeah, they explained us during financial training that if big house twice expensive, obviously might hit by higher price, but ours will get we will have to pay less. Interesting enough.
Absolutely.
Explain
I'm sure now you can appreciate when my predecessor at Redwood Area Schools gave me the report right away and asked what I thought about it. It's a complex document with a lot of and complexities that the district doesn't necessarily have control over all of them, but thank you for that question.
Thank you.
Questions? Okay, again, the recommended action is to approve the preliminary 2024 payable 2025 levy limitation and certification at the maximum amount allowed by the state. We already had a motion, seconded discussion, and so will the clerk please take the roll call vote?
Sarah Johansson,
Yes.
Paris Bende,
Yes.
Sheila Pryor, yes. Heidi Cater,
Yes.
Valentina Ayers,
Yes.
Dan Ginestra,
Yes.
Milan Sahoni.
Yes, the motion passes. Thank you. This concludes the Wayzata Public Schools special regular board meeting. The special board meeting is concluded. I'm announcing the recess now. Yeah. So we'll now take a brief 10-minute recess and reconvene for the closed meeting. Thank you.